and Ranking Member Katko, and thank you to the witnesses for testifying today. Dr. Miller-Idriss, in your report, you go into great detail about how far-right terrorism and violent extremism are escalating rapidly across the United States and how they pose a severe threat to our country's democracy. I read through your entire 13-page testimony and could not help but notice that not once, not one single time, did you mention Antifa, Black Lives Matters, or any other leftist extremist organization or movement, and their contributions to political violence and political unrest. Your own definition of terrorism included in your written testimony is, quote, the use of violence in order to intimidate or coerce civilians or influence the policies of government. You did not discuss these organizations. Coordinated efforts which led to the federal courthouse damage in Portland, Oregon during the summer of 2020, during which 18 rioters were arrested, or the $50 million worth of damage that left rioters caused to the city of Kenosha, Wisconsin in the year 2020. You also did not address the fact that the co-founder of Black Lives Matters, who is a self-proclaimed Marxist, has publicly called for the destruction of the nuclear family and the structure of the nuclear family and the national defunding of police, and has used the organization to promote its policies using violence on multiple occasions. Can you please help me understand what part of these groups' actions have been unworthy of your attention? And can you explain to me on this committee whether you think any of these examples constitute or contribute to violent extremism?
Thank you, Mr. Van Drew, for the question. I do think that we have to be concerned about rising violence from the far left as well as from the far right. I believe the FBI's testimony earlier last year indicated that there were 800 investigations into criminal activity related to the summer of 2020 protests, and that there have been 250 arrests. And I think that those figures are important. I think the CSIS data has also shown trending upward violence coming from the far left that we should be pay attention to, given the history in which in the 1970s, of course, far-right terrorism was the predominant form of terrorism. And we know that because of evolving trends, these things can change at any time. I focus on the far right in my testimony, or these terms are one of the terminology issues I think that Mr. Bishop raised, is that we don't really have a good universal definition of extremism, even across our own agencies. But one of the reasons why I focus on the far right here is because both under the Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security, and then the Office of the Director of National Intelligence after the January 6th events, declared that unlawful militia movements and white supremacist extremists pose the most lethal and pressing threat to the nation from within the domestic violent extremism spectrum. So to the extent, as long as that data is there, that's where we have to focus our efforts on the domestic side, of course.
I thank you for that. I would just maintain that in general, that we be fair and even-handed at how we look at this, because there are problems on both sides. I'm not saying there aren't problems, but those problems exist on both sides, and I think we should deal with that in a fair and even-handed way. And Mr. Greenblatt, something that comes to mind with me, because whenever government steps in and takes people's rights away, it's a very tender and sensitive issue. It's really difficult. It's not easy because our rights are so very important. And no, I wouldn't hire somebody with Nazi symbols going down their neck or anything of that nature. And either would you, I think either would anybody on this panel. But the real quick question I have for you is, how about somebody who really believes in Black Lives Matters or even in what Antifa did? But otherwise has a good record? What would you do with them?
Well, look, I got to be honest. You're entirely correct, Mr. Congressman. Violence is not the sole domain of any one extremist movement. It's an issue across the spectrum. And the people who would burn down stores and the people who would deface government buildings, the people who would commit these acts, they need to be identified, arrested, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And no, I wouldn't hire an Antifa enthusiast as an intern or as an employee at ADL, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't know that any have ever applied, but I certainly would not want anyone espousing violence in my organization. Period. End of story.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to see that. It seems that hopefully maybe we're on close to a same page on that. I just would like equal attention given to both. Thank you.
The time has
I
expired.
yield back.
Recognize the gentle lady from Michigan, Ms. Slotkin, for 5 minutes.